Hello, this is Rachel Durkin Durga, and for the next hour I'll be reading from the 4th of February issue of the Toronto Star on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Alberta government to review intersection where 3 junior hockey players died in crash by the Canadian Press. The Alberta government says it will review an intersection where 3 junior hockey players died in a car crash while heading to practice. The crash happened Monday at a highway entrance to Staveley, just over an hour's drive south of Calgary. 3 members of the town's Southern Alberta Mustangs hockey team were in a car traveling east across the highway when it collided with a northbound semi-truck hauling 2 trailers of gravel. The Provincial Transportation Ministry says it takes fatal collisions seriously and that it's common practice to review them. It says the review will look at traffic and collision data from the intersection, lighting, and other factors to determine whether any improvements are needed. RCMP says they're still investigating what caused the crash. Quote, "This is a heartbreaking tragedy, and we want to extend our deepest condolences to everyone affected," end quote, the ministry said in a statement Tuesday. Quote, "Above all, our focus remains on safety and on ensuring we can learn everything we can from this tragic event," end quote. J.J. Wright and Cameron Casorso, both 18 from Kamloops, British Columbia, and Caden Fine, 17 from Alabama, were killed in the crash. The truck driver from Staveley received minor injuries. The team is part of the U.S. Premier Hockey League's Premier Division. The mayor of Nanton, a nearby town where many Mustangs live with billet families, said such highway crossings are a fact of life for rural towns. Jen Handley said a benefit hockey game was being organized for Sunday to bring players and area residents together to support the team. Pierre Poilievre shifts strategy ahead of urgent meeting with Mark Carney by Raisa Patel. Fresh off a decisive leadership victory, Pierre Poilievre's Conservatives are seeking to present themselves as doers, not obstructors. Quote, "It's with hope and humility that I accept the endorsement of grassroots Conservatives at our party convention," end quote, Poilievre said in a social media video Monday. Quote, "The message from our convention is that Canadians want to turn hope into results," end quote. On Wednesday, Poilievre is expected to sit down with Prime Minister Mark Carney for what the Conservative is calling an, quote, "urgent meeting," end quote, to discuss how both parties can rescue Canada's trading relationship with the U.S. and accelerate parliamentary progress on a series of shared and unshared priorities. Quote, "We don't have time for taking credit or patting ourselves on the back. We need to start getting results for people now," end quote, Poilievre said. After securing the support of 87.4% of the party faithful at the Conservatives' convention in Calgary on Friday, Poilievre must now turn to potential voters outside his base as he lays the groundwork for his second bid to become Prime Minister. Part of that work means addressing criticisms Poilievre faced in the lead-up to last spring's campaign about focusing too much on what was wrong with Canada instead of how to fix it. During that campaign, the Star reported on an internal Conservative document that showed, for example, how the party used committees in the last Parliament to maximize social media exposure and advance partisan narratives. Quote, "I mean, ultimately, what we've been talking about all along and sometimes get chastised for talking about too much is that we want to help create legislation or laws or changes to policies that help Canadians with affordability, housing, fighting crime, things like that," end quote, Poilievre's campaign manager Steve Outhouse told CTV Power Play host Vasi Kapelos on Monday. Quote, "So I do think there are some shared items of interest that are on the government's agenda right now. Some of them we'd like to go further as Conservatives, but for today, let's get things done," end quote. In the days since Poilievre's leadership vote, that strategy has been on display. On Monday, MPs unanimously backed a motion from Conservative Deputy Leader Melissa Lantsman, which sought to accelerate the passage of the Liberals' Canada Groceries and Essentials Benefit Act, an affordability pledge that would hike the existing GST credit and see eligible households receive a one-time top-up payment. That didn't mean the Conservatives fully applauded Carney's measure. Lantsman said the, quote, ink is not even dry, end quote, on last fall's federal budget, but that the GST credit boost, quote, is another $12 billion of unaccounted spending, end quote. This week, the Conservatives also followed through on their promise to help fast-track the implementation of a Canada-Indonesia trade deal. On Tuesday, one Tory MP, Hamilton East, Stony Creek's Ned Currick, posted an image of that vote on social media. In an unusual sight, the image depicts three people, Poilievre, Currick, and Carney, all voting yes to sending the Trade Pact bill to committee. Perhaps the clearest example of the Conservatives attempting to position themselves as a government in waiting occurred later Tuesday, when Bowmanville, Oshawa North MP Jamil Jivani announced he was en route to Washington, D.C. Quote, I'm going to Washington because I want to help Prime Minister Mark Carney be successful in negotiating a trade deal with the United States. Now that might sound counterintuitive because I am a principled conservative. He is our liberal prime minister. But the reality is that this is not a partisan issue, end quote, Jivani said in a video posted on social media, adding that he was, quote, acting, end quote, on Poilievre's offer to help Carney with the trade file. Quote, there are people who've been running around this country for over a year now talking about how their elbows flapping about, and I just don't find that impressive. As a guy who went to law school in the United States and has a strong network there, I think I have something to offer to help build bridges for communication between our two countries. Neither Jivani's team nor Poilievre's office responded to the Star's questions about who the MP, a longtime friend of U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance, would be meeting. The Carney Liberals on Tuesday sought to frame Poilievre's meeting with the Prime Minister as a regular part of a minority parliament. Quote, the Prime Minister seeks meetings with opposition leaders all the time, end quote, said Government House Leader Steve McKinnon. Quote, we asked the Conservatives to move forward quickly on our affordability measures. They accepted to do that. Maybe we'll find some other things, end quote. Former Conservative Prime Minister Stephen Harper on Monday offered advice for the government and the opposition in the House of Commons when he spoke in a fireside chat about the need to learn, quote, mature lessons of political leadership. There are times you've got to pick your battles, right, whether you're government or opposition. There are times like now where you have to decide we're not going to fight about that. You're always going to be fighting about something because the public needs to be given choices, end quote, Harper said. Quote, but on big things like, Canadian sovereignty, we need to work together. There's times when the opposition needs to support the government, and the opposition needs to know that if it does that, the government is not going to exploit that to disadvantage the opposition. So there are times when you've just got to use better judgment, end quote. Toys R Us Canada files for creditor protection, will honor gift cards for 14 days. By Estella Wren and Anastasia Blosser. Toys R Us Canada says it has filed for creditor protection as it seeks to restructure its struggling business. The toy retailer said in a press release that it is evaluating, quote, strategic alternatives, end quote, and will implement restructuring measures, including, quote, reducing its retail footprint to better position the company in today's retail environment, end quote. While its 22 stores remain open for now, Toys R Us say it may reduce the number of locations it operates in the future, putting about 654 Canadian full and part-time employees at risk. The company has more than $36 million outstanding in gift card obligations and says it will honor the cards for only 14 days, starting on the date it filed for creditor protection. Toronto court records show a growing number of parties, including landlords and suppliers, have filed more than 20 lawsuits against the Canadian chain over property, mortgage, contract, and debt disagreements during the past 2 years. The claims, which amount to millions of dollars, have not been tested in court. Toys R Us Canada is the only surviving branch of the retailer and has continued to operate since its former U.S. parent company filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy and closed its American stores in 2018. During a previous creditor production process, Fairfax Financial Holdings acquired the company for roughly $300 million. After facing ongoing operational challenges, Fairfax sold the business to Putnam Investments in 2021. The Canadian retailer has since struggled to regain its footing, citing lingering effects from the COVID-19 pandemic, rising inflation, higher labor costs, supply chain challenges, and a challenging structural shift towards e-commerce. Despite recent layoffs, supplier negotiations, and the closure of 50 stores in the year leading up to fiscal 2026, these measures failed to offset the continued decline in sales, according to a court document. Toys R Us Canada now owes over $120 million to suppliers and landlords across the country. In the 10 months ending November 2025, the retailer posted a net loss of roughly $170 million, surpassing the $55 million loss recorded in 2024. Quote, without immediate relief, the business is at risk of abrupt cessation, which would materially reduce recoveries for all creditor groups, end quote, the company said in the court document. Toys R Us is expected to return to court to apply for a liquidation sale of its inventory, furniture, and fixtures, as well as a structured sale and investment solicitation process to find a last-minute buyer for the company's business. Customers have not been able to make online purchases through the toy company's Canadian website since January because of, quote, website improvements, end quote, according to a notice on its site. Prior to filing for creditor protection, an increasing number of lawsuits launched against Toys R Us had already raised concerns among retail analysts that the company was in financial distress. Last month, the real estate firm RioCan Holdings sued Toys R Us Canada for allegedly failing to pay rent on its lease at the Lawrence Allen Centre, prompting RioCan to terminate its lease on January 20th. Court records show that 6 toy suppliers, including Spin Master, maker of Melissa and Doug and Hatchimals, Huffy Corporation, Dynacraft BSC, Baby Einstein, and Gerber distributor Kid Central Supply, have filed lawsuits against Toys R Us Canada over the past year, seeking more than $4 million for allegedly unpaid merchandise. Quote, this is an organization which doesn't have enough to operate, end quote, said Timothy Dunn, an insolvency lawyer and partner at Blaney McMurtry LLP. Quote, the fact that they're not paying stakeholders who are critical to the continuous success of their business is a good indicator that they are tight on funds, end quote. Bruce Winder, a retail analyst and former toy buyer, said the toy industry has been rapidly changing since the 1980s. When the company emerged, it flourished as a, quote, category killer, end quote, beating out department stores in sales. But after discount stores such as Walmart and e-commerce sites such as Amazon entered the market, Toys R Us struggled to compete. Vancouver-based retail strategist David Ian Gray said that Toys R Us is facing a, quote, perfect storm, end quote, of pressures, including the rise of online one-stop shops, big box grocers, and Walmart expanding their toy offerings, brands selling directly to consumers, and children spending more time on digital platforms instead of traditional toys. Quote, the Toys R Us concept was built to thrive in a different era, end quote, Gray said. Quote, and that day has passed and it hasn't really changed, end quote. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Toronto Star on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Complaint accuses Gabbard of playing politics with intelligence, which spy agency rejects. by David Klepper. A complaint made about Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard months ago relates to an allegation that she withheld access to classified information for political reasons, according to a memo sent to lawmakers by the Inspector General's office and obtained by the Associated Press. That allegation in the complaint filed in May appeared to not be credible, according to the former watchdog for the intelligence community that initially reviewed it. It has become a flashpoint for Gabbard's critics, who accuse her of withholding information from members of Congress tasked with providing oversight of the intelligence services. Copies of the top-secret complaint are being hand-delivered this week to the Gang of 8 lawmakers, a group comprised of the House and Senate leaders from both parties, as well as the top Democrats and Republicans on the House and Senate Intelligence Committees. Gabbard's office has denied the allegations and disputed that it withheld the complaint, saying the delay in getting it to lawmakers was due to an extensive legal review necessitated by the complaint's many classified details, as well as last year's government shutdown. Democrat Senator Mark Warner of Virginia told reporters that he had not seen the complaint as of Tuesday, but that he expected to see it within a couple days, following what he called a protracted effort by lawmakers from both parties to pressure Gabbard to send the report as required by law. Quote, "It took the Gang of 8 6 months of negotiation with the Director of National Intelligence to share that whistleblower complaint," Warner said. This is in direct contradiction to what Gabbard testified during her confirmation hearings, that she would protect whistleblowers and share the information of timely matter, end quote. The author of the complaint, in a second allegation, accused Gabbard's Office of General Counsel of failing to report a potential crime to the Department of Justice. The IG's memo, which contains redactions, does not offer further details of either allegation. In June, then Inspector General Tamara Johnson found that the claim Gabbard distributed classified information along political lines did not appear to be credible, according to the current watchdog Christopher Fox in the memo to lawmakers. Johnson was, quote, "unable to assess the apparent credibility," end quote, of the accusation about the General Counsel's office, Fox wrote. Federal law allows whistleblowers in the intelligence services to refer their complaints to the Gang of 8 lawmakers even if they have been found non-credible, as long as their complaint is determined to raise urgent concerns. In his memo, Fox wrote that he would have deemed the complaint non-urgent, meaning it never would have been referred to lawmakers. Quote, "If the same or similar matter came before me today, I would likely determine that the allegations do not meet the statutory definition of, quote, urgent concern," end quote, Fox wrote. Andrew Bakaj, attorney for the person who made the complaint, said Monday that while he cannot discuss the details of the report, there is no justification for keeping it from Congress since last spring. The referral of the complaint to lawmakers isn't simple because it contains classified details that necessitate it being hand-delivered, resulting in a process that is likely to take a few days. The Inspector General's office confirmed that some lawmakers and their staff were allowed to read copies of the complaint on Monday. Representatives for the Inspector General plan to meet with the remaining lawmakers who had not seen it on Wednesday, a spokesperson for the office said. Gabbard coordinates the work of the nation's 18 intelligence agencies. She has recently drawn attention for another matter, appearing on site last week when the FBI served a search warrant on election offices in Georgia that are central to Trump's disproven claims about fraud in the 2020 election. That unusual role for a spy chief raised additional questions from Democrats on the House and Senate Intelligence Committees. Gabbard said Trump asked her to be present at the search. She defended her role in a letter to lawmakers, arguing that she regularly works with the FBI and is authorized to investigate any threat to election security. Warner said Tuesday that he doesn't accept Gabbard's explanation and that her actions are eroding long-standing barriers separating intelligence work from domestic law enforcement. He said he wants Gabbard to address his questions before the Senate Intelligence Committee soon. Quote, "The Director of National Intelligence does not conduct criminal investigations," end quote, Warner said. Quote, "She has no role in executing search warrants, and she does not belong on the scene of a domestic FBI search," end quote. Deal reached to protect identities of Epstein victims in documents release by Michael R. Sisak and Larry Neumeister. A deal was reached between lawyers for victims of Jeffrey Epstein and the Justice Department to protect the identities of nearly 100 women whose lives were allegedly harmed after the government began releasing millions of documents last week, a lawyer told a federal judge on Tuesday. Judge Richard M. Berman in Manhattan canceled a hearing scheduled for Wednesday after he was notified by Florida attorney Brittany Henderson that, quote, "extensive and constructive discussions," end quote, with the government had resulted in an agreement. Henderson and attorney Brad Edwards had complained to Berman in a letter Sunday that, quote, "immediate judicial intervention," end quote, was needed after there were thousands of instances when the government had failed to redact names and other personally identifying information of women sexually abused by Epstein. Among 8 women whose comments were included in the lawyer's Sunday letter, one of the records released was, quote, "life-threatening," end quote, while another said she'd gotten death threats and she was forced to shut down her credit cards and banking accounts after their security was jeopardized. The lawyers had requested that the Justice Department website be temporarily shut down and that an independent monitor be appointed to ensure no further errors occurred. Henderson did not say what government lawyers said to ensure identities would be protected going forward, or what the agreement consisted of. Quote, "We trust that the deficiencies will be corrected expeditiously and in a manner that protects victims from further harm," end quote, she wrote to the judge. The Justice Department did not immediately respond to a request for comment. The judge wrote in an order canceling the Wednesday public hearing that he was, quote, "pleased but not surprised that the parties were able to resolve the privacy issues," end quote. On Monday, U.S. Attorney Jay Clayton in Manhattan wrote in a letter filed in Manhattan Federal Court that errors blamed on, quote, "technical or human error," end quote, occurred on redactions during the document release. He said the Justice Department had improved its protocols to protect victims and had taken down nearly all materials identified by victims or their lawyers, along with many more that the government had found on its own. Mistakes in the largest release of Epstein documents yet included nude photos showing the faces of potential victims, as well as names, email addresses, and other identifying information that was either unredacted or not fully obscured. Most of the materials that were released stemmed from sex trafficking probes of Epstein and his former girlfriend, British socialite Ghislaine Maxwell, who is serving a 20-year prison sentence after she was convicted in December 2021 at a New York trial. Epstein took his life in a federal jail in New York in August 2019 while awaiting trial on sex trafficking charges. Trump administration looks to rebuild critical minerals supply chain by the Associated Press. President Donald Trump's administration is expected to unveil its grandest plan yet to rebuild supply chains of critical minerals needed for everything from jet engines to smartphones, likely through purchase agreements with partners on top of creating a $12 billion U.S. strategic reserve to help counter China's dominance. Vice President J.D. Vance is set to deliver a keynote address Wednesday at a meeting Secretary of State Marco Rubio is hosting with officials from several dozen European, Asian, and African nations. The U.S. is expected to sign deals on supply chain logistics, though details haven't been revealed. Rubio met Tuesday with foreign ministers from South Korea and India to discuss critical minerals mining and processing. The meeting and expected agreements will come just 2 days after Trump announced Project Vault, or a stockpile of critical minerals, to be funded with a $10 billion loan from the U.S. Export-Import Bank and nearly $1.67 billion in private capital. Brothers of Renee Good, Woman Killed by Immigration Officer, Call for Action in Congress, by Rebecca Santana. The brothers of Renee Good, one of 2 U.S. citizens killed by federal immigration officers in Minneapolis, called on Congress to do something about the violence on American streets as a result of immigration operations, warning Tuesday that the scenes playing out are, quote, changing many lives, including ours, forever, end quote. Good, a 37-year-old mother of 3, was shot and killed January 7th. Her death and that of another protester, Alex Pretty, just weeks later, have sparked outrage across the country and calls to rein in immigration enforcement. Brothers Luke and Brett Ganger spoke during a hearing held Tuesday by congressional Democrats to highlight use of force incidents by officers from the Department of Homeland Security as they arrest and deport immigrants. The mood was somber as the brothers spoke, often comforting each other as they talked about and listened to others speaking. Luke Ganger, speaking of the, quote, deep distress, end quote, the family felt at losing their sister in, quote, such a violent and unnecessary way, end quote, didn't specify what they wanted from Congress, but painted his sister's death as a turning point that should inspire change in operations such as those going on in Minneapolis. Quote, the completely surreal scenes taking place on the streets of Minneapolis are beyond explanation. This is not just a bad day or a rough week or isolated incidents, he said. These encounters with federal agents are changing the community and changing many lives, including ours, forever, end quote. The forum was put on by Senator Richard Blumenthal, Democrat of Connecticut, and Representative Robert Garcia, Democrat of California, to spotlight use of force complaints against Homeland Security officers tasked with carrying out President Donald Trump's mass deportation agenda. Trump administration officials said Good tried to run over an officer with her vehicle. State and local officials in Minneapolis, as well as protesters, have rejected that characterization. The 2 brothers didn't delve into the details of their sister's death or what the administration has said about her. Instead, they spoke about her life. Luke Ganger said the most important thing the brothers could do was to explain to those listening, quote, what a beautiful American we have lost, a sister, a daughter, a mother, a partner, and a friend, end quote. Brett Ganger shared some of the eulogy he had written for his sister's funeral service. He compared her to dandelions that grow and bring beauty in unexpected places. Quote, she believed tomorrow could be better than today. She believed that kindness mattered, and she lived that belief, end quote, he said. The panel also heard from 3 other U.S. citizens who detailed their treatment by Homeland Security officers. The difficulty in reaching a bipartisan consensus on ICE funding by the Associated Press. Despite rare negotiations between Democrats and President Donald Trump, a bipartisan agreement on new restrictions for federal immigration enforcement in the next 2 weeks will be exceedingly difficult, or even, quote, an impossibility, end quote, as Republican Senate Majority Leader John Thune said. Congress is discussing potential new rules for immigration and customs enforcement and U.S. Customs and Border Protection after officers shot and killed 2 Minneapolis protesters in January. The negotiations come amid some bipartisan sentiment that Congress should step in to de-escalate tensions over the enforcement operations that have rocked Minnesota and other states. But it's unclear if the president or enough congressional Republicans will agree to any of the Democrats' larger demands that the officers unmask and identify themselves, obtain judicial warrants in certain cases, and work with local authorities, among other asks. Republicans have already pushed back. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Toronto Star on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Israel strikes Gaza, killing 21, including women and children, after saying Hamas violated deal, by Wafa Sharafa, Sami Magdi, and Julia Frankel. Israeli strikes pounded Gaza on Wednesday, killing at least 21 Palestinians, including 2 infants, and further rocking a fragile ceasefire deal, hospital officials said. Israel said it was responding to a militant attack on Israeli soldiers that seriously wounded 1. Deadly Israeli strikes have repeatedly punctuated the truce since it came into effect on October 10th, and the escalating Palestinian toll has made many in Gaza say it feels like the war is continuing unabated. Among the Palestinians killed Wednesday were 5 children, 7 women, and an on-duty paramedic, according to hospital officials. Quote, "The genocidal war against our people in the Gaza Strip continues," end quote, said Dr. Mohammed Abu Salmaya, director of Gaza City's Shifa Hospital, in a Facebook post. Quote, "Where is the ceasefire? Where are the mediators?" End quote. Israel strongly denies accusations that it is committing genocide in Gaza. The war began on October 7, 2023, when thousands of Hamas-led militants poured into southern Israel after a surprise barrage of rockets, killing 1,200 people, most of them civilians, and abducting 251. Deadly strikes have continued despite ceasefire deal. The deal attempted to halt the more than 2-year-old war between Israel and Hamas. While the heaviest fighting has subsided, it has been marred by repeated flare-ups of violence. A total of 556 Palestinians have been killed by Israel and 1,500 wounded since the ceasefire went into effect, according to Gaza health officials, while Israel's military says 4 Israeli soldiers have been killed. Israel's military has said its continuing strikes are responses to Hamas violations or militant attacks on its soldiers, but dozens of civilians have died. 8 Arab and Muslim countries, including mediators Egypt and Qatar, recently condemned what they called Israel's, quote, "repeated violations," end quote, of the deal. An Israeli military official, speaking on the condition of anonymity in line with military policy, told the Associated Press that Israel's latest attacks were in response to militant gunfire that badly wounded a reservist soldier Wednesday morning. Early morning strike kills 11, including 2 children. Israeli troops fired on a building in the Tufa neighborhood in North Gaza, killing at least 11 people, most from the same family, said Shifa Hospital, which received the bodies. The dead included 2 parents, their 10-day-old girl Watin Kabaz, her 5-month-old cousin Mira Kabaz, and the children's grandmother. Mourners gathered in the courtyard of Shifa Hospital Wednesday morning for funeral prayers. Quote, "What did this child do? Why are they killing the children?" End quote, asked a relative of the family, Mohammed Jasser. Quote, "We don't understand why this is happening to us. What do we do? Where do we go? This isn't life," end quote, he said. 2 young children were seen kneeling at the body of their father as a woman told them to bid him farewell. A young girl kissed her father's cheeks. Strikes on Gaza continue into Wednesday afternoon. Later, an Israeli strike on a family's tent in the southern city of Khan Yunis killed 3 people, including a 12-year-old boy, said Nasser Hospital, which received the bodies. A strike on a tent in the Mawasi area of Khan Yunis killed at least 2 people and wounded 5 others, according to a field hospital run by the Palestinian Red Crescent in the area. The dead included Hussein Hassan Hussein al-Samiri, a paramedic who was on duty at the time, said the hospital. 38 Palestinians were wounded in total by the strikes Wednesday, the Gaza Health Ministry said. Russia and Ukraine envoys meet in Abu Dhabi for U.S.-brokered talks, by Kamila Hrabchuk. Envoys from Moscow and Kyiv met in Abu Dhabi on Wednesday for another round of U.S.-brokered talks on ending the almost 4-year war as Russian cluster munitions killed 7 people at a market in Ukraine. The delegations from Moscow and Kyiv were joined in the United Arab Emirates by U.S. officials. Rustem Umerov, Ukraine's National Security and Defense Council chief, who was present at the meeting, said on social media. Umarov said the planned 2-day negotiations in Abu Dhabi started with all 3 delegations present, after which negotiators were to break into groups according to topics and then meet as a full group again at the end. The American team was due to include Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and President Donald Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner, who also attended last month's meeting, according to the White House. The current talks also coincide with the expiry of the last remaining nuclear arms pact between Russia and the United States on Thursday. Trump and Putin could extend the terms of the treaty or renegotiate its conditions in an effort to prevent a new nuclear arms race. Last month's discussions in the Emirati capital, part of a U.S. push to end the fighting, yielded some progress but no breakthrough on key issues, officials said. The Abu Dhabi talks were held amid Ukrainian outrage over major Russian attacks on its energy system, which have occurred each winter since Russia launched its all-out invasion of its neighbor on February 24, 2022. A huge Russian bombardment overnight from Monday to Tuesday included hundreds of drones and a record 32 ballistic missiles, wounding at least 10 people. This came despite Ukraine's understanding that Russian President Vladimir Putin had told Trump he would temporarily halt strikes on Ukraine's power grid. Ukrainian civilians are struggling with one of the coldest winters in years, which saw temperatures around minus 20 degrees Celsius or minus 4 Fahrenheit. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov wouldn't offer any details on the Abu Dhabi talks and said that Moscow wasn't planning any comment on their results. He said that, quote, the doors for a peaceful settlement are open, end quote, but noted that Moscow will press its military action until Kyiv meets its demands. Russia is hitting Ukraine's energy facilities because its armed forces believe the targets are associated with Kyiv's military effort, Peskov said. There has been a lack of clarity about how long Putin had promised to observe a pause on power grid attacks. Trump said Tuesday at the White House that Putin had agreed to halt strikes for a week through February 1st, and that the Russian leader had kept his word. But Zelensky said Tuesday that, quote, barely 4 days have passed of the week Russia was asked to hold off, end quote, before Ukraine was hit with fresh attacks, suggesting the Ukrainian leader wasn't fully aware of the terms of the Trump-Putin agreement. Meanwhile, White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt said Trump was, quote, unfortunately unsurprised, end quote, by Moscow's resumption of attacks. On Wednesday, more than 200 repair crews were at work in Kyiv to restore power, the Ukrainian Energy Ministry said, adding that staff were exhausted and would be rotated. More than 1,100 apartment buildings in the capital were still without heating, Zelensky said. The Institute for the Study of War, a Washington think tank, said the developments were part of Moscow's negotiating strategy. Quote, the Kremlin will likely attempt to portray its adherence to this short-term energy strikes moratorium as a significant concession to gain leverage in the upcoming peace talks, even though the Kremlin used these few days to stockpile missiles for a larger strike package, end quote, it said late Tuesday. Russia used cluster munitions Wednesday in an attack on a busy market in eastern Ukraine that killed 7 and wounded 8 others, officials said. The attack on the town of Druzhkivka darkened prospects for progress in the UAE, with Donetsk Regional Military Administration Chief Vadim Filashkin describing Russian talk of a ceasefire as, quote, worthless, end quote. Russia also launched 105 drones against Ukraine overnight, and air defenses shot down 88 of them, the Ukrainian Air Force said Wednesday. Strikes by 17 drones were recorded at 14 locations, as well as falling debris at 5 sites, it said. In the central, I'm going to spell this, Dnipropetrovsk region, a Russian strike on a residential area killed a 68-year-old woman and a 38-year-old man, Regional Military Administration head Oleksandr Hansha said. The southern city of Odessa also came under a large-scale attack, Regional Military Administration head Oleg Kipper said. About 20 residential buildings were damaged, with 4 people rescued from under the rubble, he said. Leader of South Africa's second biggest political party says he will step down, by the Associated Press. The leader of South Africa's second biggest political party said Wednesday that he will not stand for re-election for the leadership of the Democratic Alliance. John Steenhuisen led his party's election campaign in 2024, when the African National Congress lost its parliamentary majority for the first time since it came into power at the end of apartheid, or white minority rule, in 1994. He was an integral part of negotiations that led to a government of national unity between the DA, ANC, and smaller parties. In his announcement Wednesday, Steenhuisen described that as one of his biggest political achievements. Quote, "It was only by gaining access to the levers of national power that we could ever hope to build a more prosperous, fair, and successful country," end quote, Steenhuisen said. He added that it was crucial for the DA to evolve from an opposition party to playing a meaningful role in the government. His departure follows political tension in his party that included claims that he had misused party funds, but an internal investigation cleared him of the allegations. Following the formation of the Government of National Unity, Steenhuisen was appointed as Minister of Agriculture. He intends to remain in that role. He said a main objective is tackling an ongoing foot and mouth disease outbreak, and that it would be difficult while leading a campaign for re-election. His party is set to hold a conference in April before contesting local government elections later in the year. Myanmar military-backed party declared election winner as army plans new body to maintain control, by the Associated Press. Myanmar's military-backed party emerged the winner of an election, final official figures showed Wednesday, as the country's army chief signed a law authorizing a new consultative body that could allow him to retain influence without formally leading the new government. The victory of the Union Solidarity and Development Party, or USDP, led by former generals, was widely expected after the vote excluded major opposition parties and sharply restricted dissent. The Constitution guarantees 25% of parliamentary seats for the military, effectively ensuring control by the armed forces and allied parties. Senior General Min Aung Hlaing, head of the military government, was widely expected to assume the presidency when the new parliament convenes. The Constitution, however, bars a president from serving concurrently as the Army's commander-in-chief, the country's most powerful post, raising questions about whether he would relinquish that role. The possibility that Min Aung Hlaing might not want to formally lead the new government was highlighted Wednesday after he signed a law authorizing the creation of a new Union Consultative Council, a body that could allow its chairman to wield influence without taking center stage. The law, published in the state-run Myanmar Aline newspaper, allows the new president to form the council with at least 5 members, including a chairman. It says the council could advise and coordinate on national security, international relations, peace processes, and legislation without affecting executive or judicial powers. The move reflects the military's use of parallel bodies since the Army seized power in 2021 from the elected government led by Aung San Suu Kyi, plunging the country into widespread unrest and armed resistance that has since evolved into civil war. It remains unclear whether Min Aung Hlaing will lead the council, which was announced to coincide with the release of final results from Myanmar's first election in 5 years. Voting took place in 3 phases in December and January in 263 of the country's 330 townships, leaving about 1/5 without voting because of fighting. According to final figures from the Union Election Commission, the USDP won 339 of the total 586 seats in the national parliament. That means that along with the military, which is automatically allocated 166 seats under the Constitution, the two hold 505, which is about 86% of the legislature. 21 other parties won between 1 and 20 seats each. On Wednesday, Myanmar Aline's report cited Min Aung Hlaing as saying at a meeting with senior military officials on Tuesday that the USDP won with more than 44% of nationwide vote. He added that more than 13 million voters, about 54% of the more than 24 million eligible, cast ballots in the election, describing the turnout as enthusiastic participation of the public. A separate report in Myanmar Aline said he told the visiting Russian Security Council Secretary Sergei Shoigu during a meeting in the capital on Tuesday that Parliament will convene in the third week of March to elect a new president. UN Human Rights Chief Volker Turk said in a statement Friday, marking the anniversary of the military takeover, that the election failed to respect fundamental rights and that the process served only to exacerbate violence and societal polarization. He said voter coercion was reported nationwide, including fears of forced conscription, loss of food access, and administrative penalties. Quote, "For 5 years now, the military's rule has been characterized by repression of political dissent, mass arbitrary arrests, arbitrary conscription, widespread surveillance, and limitation of civic space," Turk said. Now the military is seeking to entrench its rule by violence after forcing people to the ballot box. This couldn't be further from civilian rule, end quote. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Toronto Star on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Competition opens at Milan Cortina Olympics with mixed doubles curling by the Canadian Press. Competition begins today at the Milan Cortina Winter Olympics, 2 days before the opening ceremony. Canada's Brett Gallant and Jocelyn Peterman, a husband and wife team from Chestermere, opened the mixed doubles curling tournament against Czechia in Cortina. Canada is aiming to return to the podium in mixed doubles after missing out on a medal at the 2022 Beijing Games. Men's alpine skiing also gets underway today, with downhill training scheduled in Bormio. Several sports traditionally begin competition ahead of the opening ceremony because of the scheduling demands. The opening ceremony will be held in Friday in Milan. Chips Ahoy! Why a snack manufacturer is trying to lower prices before the Super Bowl, but not in Canada, by Raju Mudhar. Canada and the U.S. are two nations divided by their flavor preferences and now the price of potato chips. On the eve of the Super Bowl, the unofficial Olympics of snack food, PepsiCo in the U.S. has announced that it is dropping the suggested retail price of its Frito-Lay products, including brands like Lay's, Doritos, Tostitos, and more, by up to 15%. Quote, "We've spent the last year listening closely to consumers, and they've told us they're feeling the strain," end quote, said Rachel Ferdinando, CEO, PepsiCo Foods US, in a release. Quote, "Lowering the suggested retail price reflects our commitment to help reduce the pressure where we can, because people shouldn't have to choose between great taste and staying within their budget," end quote. Sounds potato-ively fabulous, but unfortunately it might be a fake punt of a play. Just like the rules of our version of the game, it's a little different up here because Canadian chip connoisseurs will not get to chomp at a lower-priced bit. Quote, "This is a U.S.-specific initiative," end quote, said a response for PepsiCo Canada Communications when asked if the price drop is also coming here. What's interesting is that while PepsiCo is asking grocers to lower the price, food manufacturers tend to have little say in what the price of a product is on the shelves, so this move is likely a combination of public relations and pressure during one of the biggest weeks for snack sales of the year. Quote, "Pepsi is basically publicly pressuring grocers to bring down their prices, because as a manufacturer they don't control prices at all. So by saying that they're reducing their prices, they want people to go into grocery stores and say, 'Hey, it's before the Super Bowl, how come my chips aren't cheaper?' End quote, said Sylvain Charlebois, professor and researcher of food distribution and policy at Dalhousie University in Halifax. Charlebois says it's interesting that the company isn't negotiating behind closed doors and instead putting the message out to consumers. Quote, they're actually going public, which is actually quite rare, to be honest, end quote, said Charlevoix. Food prices and grocery store inflation have been a hot-button issue on both sides of the border for years. Charlevoix also pointed out that the snack food aisle has been feeling some pressure from things like the healthy eating and wellness movements. Canadian packaging points out what's unhealthy about certain foods, and even the GLP-1 weight loss phenomenon, which works by suppressing appetites, means that people using those medications are cutting down on snacks like chips. Chip prices have gone up for various reasons, including inflation, rising costs, potato crops affected by climate change, and supply chain disruptions. But as any chip consumer knows, the price of a bag, which has arguably been hit by shrinkflation too, varies wildly from store to store. Beyond pricing, Canadians have long had specific and varied chip tastes, with a narrative research survey from December 2024 proclaiming that 46% of Canadians named ketchup as their favorite flavor of chips. According to Statista, the U.S. prefers plain chips, followed by barbecue as its top flavors. Another Canadian flavor creation, all dressed, came in third in Canada with 13%, but that flavor is now getting its big chance in the U.S. And if its parent company has its way, it will be available for a cheaper price in the U.S., but not in Canada. Trevi Fountain fee takes effect as Rome seeks to manage tourist crowds, by Paolo Santalucia and Nicole Winfield. Tourists hoping to get close to the Trevi Fountain had to pay €2 or $2.35 starting Monday as the city of Rome inaugurated a new fee structure to help raise money and control crowds at one of the world's most celebrated waterworks. The first tourists to pass through the new ticket check seemed unfazed by the tariff, noting it was a small price to pay for quality access to a fountain made famous by Federico Fellini's movie La Dolce Vita. Quote, before there were problems accessing the fountain, there were a lot of people. Now it's very easy, end quote, said Ilhan Musba, a tourist from Morocco. Quote, you can take photos, you feel good, you're comfortable, and on top of that, €2 is not much, end quote. The tourist fee was rolled out in conjunction with a new €5, nearly $6, tourist ticket fee for some city museums. In both cases, Rome residents are exempt from the fees, and the extra revenue will actually expand the number of city-run museums that are free for registered Roman residents. It's all part of the Eternal City's efforts to manage tourist flows in a particularly congested part of town, improve the experience, and offset the maintenance costs of preserving all of Rome's cultural heritage. Officials estimate it could net the city €6.5 million or $7.6 million extra a year. The city decided to impose the Trevi Fountain fee after seeing positive results already from a year-long experiment to stagger and limit the number of visitors who can reach the front edge of the basin by imposing lines and pathways for entrance and exit. Quote, I think tourists were shocked by the fact that the city of Rome is only asking for €2 for a site of this level, end quote, Alessandro Onorato, Rome's assessor of tourism, said Monday. Quote, I believe that if the Trevi Fountain were in New York, they would have charged at least $100, end quote. The fee follows a similar ticketing system at Rome's Pantheon Monument and the more complicated tourist day tripper tax that the lagoon city of Venice imposed last year in a bid to ease over-tourism and make the city more livable for residents. The Italian fees still pale in comparison to the 45% price hike that French authorities announced for the Louvre Museum for most non-European visitors, where tickets can now run to €32 or $37 from €22 or $26. The Trevi fee, which can be paid in advance online, enables tourists to get close to the fountain during prime-time daylight hours. The view for those admiring the late Baroque masterpiece from the piazza above remains free, as it is up close after hours. The towering fountain features the Titan god Oceanus, flanked by falls cascading down the travertine rocks into a shallow turquoise pool, where Marcello Mastroianni and Anita Ekberg famously took their nighttime dip in La Dolce Vita. While bathing is prohibited nowadays, legends has it that visitors who toss a coin over their shoulders and make a wish will return to Rome. You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the 4th of February issue of the Toronto Star. Your reader has been Rachel Durkin-Durga. Thank you for listening.